Since its discovery, fire has been humanity's dual-edged ally, offering warmth and wreaking havoc. Historical infernos have driven strict modern regulations to prevent disasters, yet fire often finds a way despite precautions. Here are some of the most devastating building fires in recorded history, illustrating the persistent challenge of safeguarding against this formidable force. On December 30th, 1903, around 2,000 patrons flocked to the magnificent Iroquois Theater to watch the beloved children's musical Mr. Bluebeard, featuring the famed comedian Eddie Foy. The audience, filled with anticipation, remained blissfully unaware of the impending tragedy unfolding just behind the curtains. A catastrophe was about to strike, forever marking that fateful evening in history. Opened in November, 6 weeks before the play's performance, the Iroquois Theater was a luxurious three-tiered building with mahogany glass doors and marble and gold pillars. To capitalize on the holidays in place, construction was rushed to prevent a late opening, which would mean poor ticket sales. With this in place and the rapidly expanding city at the time, it took a lot of work for state officials to inspect the place for safety properly. The theater would be advertised as fireproof and safe. And in fact, not only the fire commissioner, but also the fire inspector declared the building fireproof. On that fateful afternoon of the incident, the play was sold out, and even more tickets were sold, so the audience in the auditorium surpassed its capacity. The audience was primarily children out of school for their holiday and the children's caregivers. As the performance ensued, the stage manager left backstage to watch the play for himself, and the other stagehands left to grab drinks. It was about to get down in the then empty backstage. Faulty wiring from the stage light had begun sending sparks everywhere, and it did not help that there were many flammable materials backstage. A muslin curtain caught one of the sparks, and a fire soon began. The spotlight operator noticed the fire backstage, but it may have been too late. When the smoke reached the stage, the actors panicked and ran away. However, the leading actor, Eddie Foy, assured the audience that there was nothing to worry about and that the matter would be swiftly handled. The stage manager had already begun trying to deploy the asbestos fire curtain, but it was stuck and would not fall. The audience started to panic, and sooner or later the fire made its way into the auditorium. A series of design flaws made the incident more tragic than it should have been. One was that there was just a single stairwell for the 3 tiers of the theater. This led to trampling at the bottom of the stairs. Another flaw was that the doors to the auditorium opened inwards and not outwards, so when panicky audience members were jammed at the door, they couldn't open it. The lights went out after the fire entered the auditorium, and the real panic began. Only 3 of the theater's 30 doors were open for escape. The other 27 were locked or obscured by decorations. Patrons on the balcony of the auditorium, with no means to escape as no ladder was provided, jumped to their deaths. Ultimately, over 600 patrons died that day from various causes like trampling, crushing, burns, and asphyxiation. Less than 100 of the deaths were able to be identified that day as the bodies were too charred beyond recognition. Investigations after the incident showcased many cases involving malpractices, such as the absence of any fire alarm, sprinklers, and emergency illumination. No one was charged concerning the many mistakes leading to the fire, and in fact, the only arrest made was of a pickpocket who had tried stealing valuable items belonging to the dead patrons. On the chilly night of November 28th, during the Thanksgiving weekend of 1942, over 1,000 patrons, more than twice the legal limit, packed the Coconut Grove nightclub, seeking a night of revelry. Unbeknownst to them, disaster loomed. In a matter of moments, the entire structure was engulfed in flames, claiming countless lives. This catastrophic event is not only one of Boston's most devastating fires, but also the deadliest nightclub fire in history, leaving an indelible mark on the city and its fire safety regulations. While 2 main theories exist about the fire's origin, the nightclub was inherently a fire hazard. The single-story building housed a restaurant with a ballroom on the first floor and the Melody Lounge bar in the basement. Its main entrance, a revolving door, further complicated the escape, making the club a disaster waiting to happen. Opened in 1927 during the Prohibition era, the establishment was pretty profitable, and so it passed from owner to owner until its last proprietor, a lawyer, Barney Wilansky. To profit from his investment, Wolanski made a series of aesthetic changes to the club. He installed artificial palm trees around the club, covered the walls in leather, and covered the ceiling in satin. Wolanski cut some costs to make a profit, like using his relationship with the then mayor to hire a cheap and unlicensed electrician to wire the place. On the night of November 28th, Coconut Grove was packed for several reasons. The local football team, celebrating a winning streak, had chosen the club for their victory party despite losing their match that day. The celebration was already planned, and fans still gathered. Additionally, the famous actor Buck Jones, who had visited a children's hospital earlier, drew even more patrons to the club. These factors combined to create a perfect storm of overcrowding on that fateful night. Over 1,000 people gathered in the club, even though its legal capacity was 460. The scene was described as a standing room as all the chairs and tables were taken. There was singing and dancing, but all that would change very quickly. Sometime before 10 p.m., a sailor in a secluded corner of Melody Bar in the basement wanted a little private time with his date. He unscrewed a bulb, plunging that corner into the darkness to ensure their private moment. 16-year-old busboy Stanley Tomaszewski was called to fix a light. As he installed a new bulb, he lit a match. In his testimony during the subsequent inquest, Stanley claimed he had extinguished the match, but a crucial detail emerged about the air that night. Due to wartime shortages during the Second World War, the air conditioning unit used methyl chloride instead of the safer Freon, creating a highly flammable environment. Within moments after Stanley changed the bulb, a palm tree rose in flames. Bartenders tried putting out the fire but were largely unsuccessful. Panicky guests began running to the basement's fire escape, a set of stairs leading to the first floor. In a swift turn of events, the fire began climbing up to the first floor where scared patrons dashed it. Their escape would be futile, as with weight on both sides of the revolving door, it would not budge. Shortly after, the lights went out. The next scene resembled a horror story. Screams and panic filled the air as patrons struggled to find a way out. Their escape was further hindered by the club owner, who had blocked other exits to prevent dine-and-dash incidents. Confusion reigned, and many didn't know which direction to run to save their lives. Fortunately, the Boston Fire Department was nearby, putting out a car fire when they saw smoke rising from the nightclub. They quickly rushed to the scene. Soon after, the Navy, Army, Coast Guard, and National Guard reinforcements arrived, joining forces in a desperate attempt to control the blaze and save lives. One survivor said he had crouched on the floor and wet his handkerchief just to be able to breathe. Others were able to escape through the employee corridors or the windows. Others died from stampedes, asphyxiation, and severe burns. All in all, there were about 492 casualties from both victims who died immediately in the fire and others who died in the hospital later. The incident has been dubbed the deadliest nightclub fire to date. Investigations led to the arrest and conviction of the nightclub owner, Wolanski, along with the builder, building commissioner, and inspector for violating safety regulations. This tragedy spurred the enactment of new fire safety laws, including rules on revolving doors. Additionally, the successful treatment of some victims led to advancements in burn management, which were later used to treat soldiers during the ongoing war. Psychiatrist Eric Lindemann's work with the victims influenced his later published work on post-traumatic stress disorder. On March 18, 1996, students flocked to Ozone Disco, a popular nightclub in Manila, to celebrate the end of their academic session. This night, meant for revelry, turned tragic. Years earlier, the building had sat empty on the market until businessman Hermilo Ocampo acquired it, transforming it into the vibrant hotspot that would soon become infamous for one of the deadliest nightclub fires in history. Ocampo had initially set out to convert the structure into a home, but he arrived at a different idea. Seeing the popularity of electronic music at the time, Ocampo decided to convert the structure into a nightclub for youngsters. It made sense because the building had been a famous jazz club a few years before it was abandoned. The new club became famous for students seeking a fun time away from their books and academic struggles. With the cheap food and drinks, Ozone Disco was never out of customers. On the night of March 18, 1996, Ozone hosted a graduation promo that over 350 patrons attended. However, based on safety measures, the space was supposed to hold just 35 people. This and other violations, such as having only one emergency exit, would lead to a high casualty rate that night. It did not help that the building's ceiling was adorned with decorative egg cartons, a flammable material, and the walls were lined with acoustic foam for noise and sound control. Roughly around 11 p.m., a flash of light graced the room, but the patrons were all engrossed in their party, and those who noticed believed it was only special effects. Tragedy struck in only a matter of seconds. A fire started, but the patrons were not aware. In a string of bad luck, the DJ had noticed the fire, but could not raise an alarm as the microphone suddenly stopped working. It wasn't until the music was abruptly interrupted by an explosion that the patrons began to realize something was wrong. A girl's voice pierced the air, screaming an alarm, and chaos quickly erupted as panic swept through the nightclub. Patrons ran to the door, some of whom became stampede victims. Like the other stories mentioned, the door opened inward, so they were trapped when the partygoers were jammed on it. During this time, they inhaled poisonous gases from the fumes. Finally, the door gave way, but the patrons' relief was short-lived. The sudden rush of oxygen into the oxygen-starved inferno caused a backdraft, an explosive phenomenon where a fire deprived of oxygen reignites violently when exposed to fresh air. The explosion was devastating. Survivor Sherilyn Bruin later described the experience as feeling like she was being burned all over again, underscoring the horror of that night at Ozone Disco. The fire lasted for over 2 hours, even after firefighters arrived at the scene because there weren't any nearby fire hydrants. By the time first responders were able to get inside, victims had been charred beyond recognition. Over 141 people perished in the event. Only after 18 years were Ocampo, the building's owner, and 9 others, including some city officials, convicted of the night's events. On March 25, 1911, an ordinary Saturday in New York City became a nightmare in the blink of an eye. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was bustling with activity near Washington Square Park. The factory, one of the largest in the city, employed over 500 workers, primarily young immigrant women, some as young as 14. That day, tragedy struck, forever etching this horrific event into the city's history and sparking widespread reforms in labor and fire safety laws. As the day wore on, disaster struck when a fire broke out on the 8th floor around 4:45 p.m. The exact cause remains unknown, but it is believed to have started near a rag bin. The fire quickly spread due to abundant flammable materials like cotton, paper, and oil. Workers on the 8th floor tried to escape but found the doors locked. Desperation set in as many attempted to jump from the windows only to find the fire escapes inadequate. Others tried to use the elevator, but it quickly became inoperable due to the fire, leaving them with no viable means of escape. Trapped and terrified, their situation grew increasingly dire as the flames closed in. As workers struggled to escape, firefighters arrived on the scene. Their efforts were hindered because their ladders were too short to reach the upper floors. They tried to raise a ladder to the 6th floor, but it was too heavy. The lack of access to the upper floors further complicated the fire department's efforts. Unaware of the danger below, workers on the 9th and 10th floors were told to evacuate, but the smoke and flames trapped many. Panic set in as the workers realized that they were trapped. As the fire continued to spread, the streets below filled with onlookers, who watched in horror as workers jumped from the windows. Some even tried to use life nets, but they were ineffective. The scene was chaotic, with people screaming and trying to escape. Among the bystanders was a young woman named Frances Perkins, who would later become a leading figure in labor reform. She witnessed the tragedy firsthand and was deeply affected by it. The fire department eventually managed to quench the fire, but not before it had claimed the lives of 146 workers, primarily young women. Many more were injured, and some suffered from smoke inhalation. In the aftermath, investigations revealed the factory's negligence towards fire safety. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, had locked doors to prevent theft and had no fire drills or evacuation plans. The tragedy sparked widespread outrage and calls for labor reform. Frances Perkins led the Factory Investigating Commission, which established itself and investigated shocking conditions in factories across New York City, leading to widespread reforms. The commission's findings led to the passage of landmark legislation, including the 54-hour workweek and workers' compensation laws. The New York State Department of Labor was also established to prioritize workers' safety and well-being. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a turning point in labor history, highlighting the need for better working conditions and workers' rights. It led to a wave of labor activism, with workers demanding safer working conditions, fair wages, and better treatment. In October 2023, around 200 people gathered. A memorial was dedicated to the victims, ensuring that their memory would never be forgotten. June 14, 2017, will forever be remembered by the residents of Grenfell Tower in North Kensington, London. It started like any other day, but a fire broke out early on the 4th floor of the 23-story tower block. The fire began in the kitchen of flat 16, where a resident, Bahailu Kabedi, had been awoken by a smoke alarm. He quickly called the fire brigade, which logged the call at 0:54. 4 fire engines were sent to the scene, with the first arriving at 0:59. As firefighters entered the flat, they were met with an isolated curtain of flame in the kitchen. Thermal images captured by the fire crew showed fire gases and flames spreading across the window space. The fire had already begun to spread to the exterior of the building, fueled by the highly combustible cladding installed during recent renovations. Despite the firefighters' efforts, the fire spread rapidly, fueled by the cladding and other flammable materials. The building's design, with a single stairwell and no sprinkler system, made it difficult for residents to escape. Many were trapped inside, some attempting to flee the stairs while others tried jumping from windows. As the fire raged, desperate residents were forced to make impossible choices. Some jumped from windows to escape the flames, while others sought refuge in flats on the upper floors. The fire service did everything it could, but was fighting a losing battle. The fire was too powerful and the building was too vulnerable. The investigation into the fire has revealed a web of negligence, incompetence, and greed that led to the tragedy. The cladding installed on the building was highly flammable and had never been tested for fire safety. The building's management company, Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, KCTMO, ignored warnings about the dangers of cladding. The public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire has been ongoing since 2017. It has revealed a series of systemic failures and human errors that contributed to the tragedy. The inquiry has heard testimony from survivors, families of the victims, and experts, painting a picture of a disaster that was preventable. The Grenfell Tower fire has become a symbol of the UK's housing crisis and the neglect of marginalised communities. It has sparked widespread outrage and calls for change, with many demanding justice for the victims and their families. As the inquiry continues, the families of the victims and survivors await answers and accountability. In the end, 72 people lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire, including 6 members of the Chusser family and 5 members of the Hashim family. The youngest victim was 6-month-old baby Lena Belkadi, who died in her mother's arms as she tried to escape. The oldest victim was 84-year-old Sheila, who had lived in Grenfell Tower for 34 years.